Feliz día. Feliz día, feliz semana a los y las afrodescendientes. Gracias a la generosidad de Costa Rica, a la generosidad de la vicepresidenta Epsi Campbell, quien fue en sí la forjadora para que tengamos actualmente un Día Internacional para los afrodescendientes. El año pasado el mundo entero fue conmocionado, conmovido, por el asesinato de George Floyd a manos de los agentes del orden. El Consejo de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas llamó una sesión urgente. En esta sesión solicitó a la alta comisionada para derechos humanos preparar un informe sobre las violaciones cometidas contra los africanos y los afrodescendientes, las violaciones de derechos humanos, especialmente aquellas hechas por las fuerzas del orden. La alta comisionada presentó un informe, el que es considerado actualmente como un hito en todo el trabajo que estamos haciendo por la igualdad racial. Este informe mostró la magnitud del racismo con cifras, con testimonios, con pruebas, y al mismo tiempo presentó una agenda para tener un cambio transformador por la justicia y la igualdad racial. Hoy estaremos hablando justamente de este informe tan importante en nuestro trabajo, y sin más tardar, la dejo a la alta comisionada presentar su informe. Gracias.
Excelencias, amigas y amigos, me complace dirigirme a ustedes en este evento. Agradezco al Gobierno de Costa Rica, en particular a la primera vicepresidenta, Epsi Campbell Barr, por la oportunidad de presentarles mi informe sobre el racismo sistémico, el cual ya presenté al Consejo de Derechos Humanos el pasado 12 de julio. El informe me fue encargado por el Consejo en su debate urgente tras el asesinato de George Floyd, un crimen que llamó la atención del mundo entero sobre las violaciones de derechos humanos soportadas por los africanos y los afrodescendientes, especialmente aquellas cometidas por las fuerzas del orden. El trabajo está fundamentado en experiencias vividas. Me reuní y escuché a los familiares de afrodescendientes muertos a manos de agentes del orden. Realizamos consultas online con más de 340 personas, en su mayoría afrodescendientes. Estas conversaciones conmovedoras, junto con más de 110 aportes recibidos de los estados y otras partes interesadas, fueron la base para nuestros análisis y recomendaciones. Examinamos cómo el racismo sistémico contra las y los africanos y las y los afrodescendientes afecta sus derechos en todos los ámbitos de su vida, agravando su marginalización y las desigualdades en el acceso a oportunidades, a recursos y al poder. Esta triste historia empieza en la primera infancia. Datos ponen de manifiesto que los niños, niñas y jóvenes afrodescendientes a menudo son víctimas de racismo y acoso en los centros educativos. Reciben peores notas debido a prejuicios y en ocasiones se les trata como delincuentes desde una temprana edad. El racismo y la discriminación generan pobreza, que a su vez produce aún más racismo y exclusión. Encontramos este círculo vicioso en muchos países, en los cuales los afrodescendientes tienen mayores probabilidades de vivir en la pobreza, incluso en su forma extrema, sin acceso a una vivienda adecuada, ni a servicios de salud, y ocupando puestos menos cualificados. Estos obstáculos se hacen mayores con la escasa participación y representación de los afrodescendientes en la toma de decisiones y en la vida pública. Cuando el género, la etnia y la condición social se entrecruzan y se refuerzan, dan lugar a una discriminación interseccional y a un racismo mucho más pernicioso que afecta a las afrodescendientes en forma particular. En el ámbito de la aplicación de la ley, mi informe se centró en incidentes con consecuencias mortales de los cuales los afrodescendientes son desproporcionadamente afectados. También constatamos una ausencia de justicia, controles policiales excesivos, incluyendo los perfiles raciales, los que acaban en mayores porcentajes de detenciones y encarcelamientos y condenas más severas, incluida la imposición desproporcionada de la pena de muerte. Mi oficina recibió información sobre al menos 190 muertes de africanos y afrodescendientes en manos de agentes del orden, de los cuales el 98% ocurrieron en Europa, América Latina y América del Norte. Además, examinamos en detalle cerca de 7 casos emblemáticos de muertes de africanos y afrodescendientes en contacto con las fuerzas del orden. Pese a los diversos sistemas jurídicos, algunas de las prácticas y problemas coinciden. Existe una recurrencia de prejuicios, estereotipos y perfiles raciales, y la asociación perjudicial y degradante del color de la piel con la criminalidad y la delincuencia. Las muertes relacionadas con la policía se destacan en 3 contextos: la actuación de las fuerzas del orden ante delitos leves, en controles de tráfico y en otros controles policiales, la intervención de agentes como equipo de respuesta ante una crisis de salud mental y la realización de operaciones policiales en el contexto de pandillas o de la llamada guerra contra las drogas. Muchos estados no han adoptado leyes ni políticas claras y eficaces sobre el uso de la fuerza, lo que aumenta el riesgo de violaciones. Además, rara vez se exige responsabilidad de los agentes del orden por las violaciones de derechos humanos y por delitos perpetrados contra los afrodescendientes. También observamos deficiencias en las investigaciones, en los mecanismos de supervisión, en las denuncias y en la rendición de cuentas. Problemas que se unen a un prejuicio generalizado de la presunta culpabilidad subyacente que pesa sobre los afrodescendientes. Además, las investigaciones, los procesamientos y los juicios no tuvieron debidamente en cuenta el posible papel que la discriminación racial y los estereotipos pueden tener en los incidentes mortales que implican a la policía. Estimadas y estimados colegas, nuestro informe también examina la respuesta de las autoridades a las protestas pacíficas contra el racismo, contra las cuales recibimos denuncias creíbles del uso innecesario y desproporcionado de la fuerza. La represión de las protestas contra el racismo en algunos países debe considerarse dentro de un contexto más amplio, en el que las voces de los afrodescendientes y las personas que luchan contra el racismo son sofocadas y los defensores de derechos humanos de los afrodescendientes afrontan represalias. Las injusticias son profundas y devastadoras, y no son recientes. Debemos urgentemente hacer frente a los legados de la esclavitud, de la trata transatlántica de hombres y mujeres esclavizados, del colonialismo y a los sucesivos sistemas y políticas racialmente discriminatorios. Debemos también procurar una justicia reparadora. Pese a algunas iniciativas en búsqueda de la verdad y formas limitadas de reparación, como conmemoraciones, reconocimientos, disculpas y actuaciones ante los tribunales, nuestra investigación no pudo encontrar ni un solo ejemplo de Estado que haya afrontado ni asumido su responsabilidad integral por el impacto que el pasado sigue teniendo en las vidas de los afrodescendientes hoy en día. Amigas y amigos, las palabras deben ser seguidas de acciones. Mi informe contiene recomendaciones prácticas para desestructurar el racismo sistemático. A ellas las organicé en 4 pilares de acción. Primera acción: los estados deben de reconocer el carácter sistémico del racismo para así poder transformar las estructuras, las instituciones y los comportamientos, involucrando al gobierno y a la sociedad en su conjunto. También es fundamental recopilar datos desglosados por raza o etnia, género, edad y otros factores. Segunda acción: los agentes del orden que hayan cometido delitos y violaciones de derechos humanos contra los africanos y los afrodescendientes deberán rendir cuenta de sus actos. Deberían crearse o reforzarse mecanismos de denuncias, además de restringir el uso de la fuerza y prohibir el uso de perfiles raciales. Un gran número de familias han denunciado ante mi oficina las enormes dificultades en obtener verdad, justicia y reparación. Hay una clara necesidad de tener mecanismos efectivos e independientes que apoyen a las personas afectadas. Acción número 3. Los estados deben defender los derechos a la libertad de expresión y de reunión pacífica y proteger a todos aquellos que levantan su voz contra el racismo. Asimismo, los estados deberían garantizar la participación y representación efectiva de los afrodescendientes, en particular las mujeres y jóvenes, y a todos los niveles, incluyendo en la administración de justicia, así como en los procesos de toma de decisiones. El último pilar de esta agenda transformadora recomienda que los estados creen procesos integrales para compartir la verdad, confrontar los legados del pasado y su impacto presente, y proporcionar medidas de reparación. Estas acciones nos ayudarán a transformar el futuro, curar cicatrices de nuestras sociedades y hacer justicia por los terribles daños y delitos cometidos. Es importante también señalar recientes avances. Luego del diálogo interactivo que tuve con el Consejo de Derechos Humanos al presentar mi informe, este órgano estableció un mecanismo internacional de expertos independientes para promover la justicia racial y la igualdad en el contexto de la aplicación de la ley. También pidió a mi oficina que refuerce y amplíe el monitoreo para informar sobre estos temas y promover la agenda transformadora. En este sentido, insto a todos los estados a cumplir con sus obligaciones y compromisos internacionales, a organizar diálogos nacionales con la participación significativa de los afrodescendientes, a traducir esta agenda en planes de acción y medidas concretas para abordar las historias y realidades específicas de cada país. Mi oficina sigue dispuesta a colaborar con los estados por intermedio de asistencia técnica, así como con las víctimas y las comunidades afectadas. A continuación, les invito a escuchar algunos testimonios y reflexiones que espero contribuyan a sensibilizar y a acelerar acciones en favor de la justicia y la igualdad racial. Muchas gracias.
I think people of African descent have done a lot to bring their concerns to the United Nations and to states. It is for those who are perpetrators to listen and implement the suggestions. We have contributed to the program of activities for the International Decade. We have contributed to the DDPA. We have attended various fora. We have written, made our suggestions. I think that people of African descent have already done all these things. And those state parties who know themselves should really just implement. The first thing they should do is apologize for the crime against humanity.
We have to educate ourselves about this history. We're not going to be able to address anything if we don't understand the damage and the history, and we've done a very poor job of that across the globe, but particularly here in the United States, where most school children are taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America without recognizing that there were millions of indigenous people here. And that gives rise to a lot of ignorance and poor policy and bad decision making. And when that narrative of racial difference made us comfortable with 2.5 centuries of enslavement, and too many American school children were taught that slavery was pleasant, that enslaved people liked being enslaved, that it wasn't brutal, that it wasn't violent, that enslavers were good and noble people. And that false narrative will block you from the kind of repair that has to happen. And that's why I don't believe that slavery ended in 1865, it just evolved. And until we contend with that, we're not going to be able to effectively address issues like police violence, like over-incarceration, like discrimination. So the beginning for me is truth-telling about the history. And that's why I talk so much about truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration. I just think these things are sequential, and we haven't done that in too many places across the globe. And that's why memorialization is such a critical part of the process. I think when people use the word reparations, they actually think some check in the mail. I think we actually have to open ourselves up to the multiple ways in which repair is going to mean doing things differently, talking differently, memorializing differently. The UN and other international organizations can contribute to our struggle by affirming these basic realities and the need for justice and equality.
The policeman that shot and killed Clinton had a troubled history with the police department, the Dallas Police Department in Texas. He was able to use qualified immunity, and he was completely exonerated. Clinton was unarmed the night that he shot and killed him. And he shot him 7 times, and 1 time in the back at close range. It was the most horrible, egregious thing that ever happened to our family. We will continue to seek justice for Clinton and trying to get, in an attempt to get his case reopened and many other family cases reopened. You can turn that grief into fuel and stand and advocate for your loved one is the best thing that you can possibly do. And we have to remember the system that was built in policing does not work. We have to demand accountability when policemen kill, holding policemen accountable through policies that preserve life.
Mon frère est mort suite à son interpellation des gendarmes ce 19 juillet 2016. Mon frère est mort le jour de son anniversaire. Je vous avoue que j'aurais pas pensé que 5 ans après, on y serait encore. La mort de mon frère, la mort de nos frères reste des faits impunis. J'ai compris que la justice n'était pas un dû pour nous, n'était pas un droit pour nous et qu'il fallait se battre pour réclamer ce dû qui nous appartient. Quand une personne noire, une personne non blanche, issue de l'immigration va mourir, on va criminaliser tout de suite la victime. Aujourd'hui, c'est comme si on vivait dans des non-dits, une histoire qui n'a pas été réparée.
Eu me chamo Roseli Barbosa dos Reis, tenho 41 anos, sou irmã da Luana Barbosa dos Reis Santos, que está aqui na camiseta, que foi assassinada pela Polícia Militar no Brasil, em Ribeirão Preto, em 2016, aos 34 anos. Pararam a minha irmã, que estava indo levar o meu sobrinho para um curso. Ela viu uns amigos no bar, parou para cumprimentar e foi abordada pela polícia. Pararam os dois, começaram a revistar minha irmã. Minha irmã era uma mulher negra, lésbica, moradora da periferia, motivo suficiente no Brasil para separar. Ela se recusou a ser revistada por um policial homem. Depois da abordagem, depois do espancamento, nós escondemos a minha irmã com medo da polícia ir matar ela, como eles tinham falado que ia fazer. E no dia seguinte, a gente levou a minha irmã, Luana, para o pronto-socorro de Ribeirão Preto, que é o Hospital das Clínicas. No dia 13 de abril de 2016, a Luana faleceu. 5 anos depois, tem todo um processo, o caso começou a ser investigado pela Polícia Civil, mas em um dado momento foi pedida a prisão preventiva dos policiais em 2016. Tudo no Brasil tem sido bem mais lento, tem sido bem mais difícil. Poderia ter tido uma audiência virtual para julgar o recurso, não sei se todos ou um dos recursos, mas eles recusaram. Então, não houve a justiça. Estar aqui hoje falando assim me conforta no sentido de pensar, não, vocês não têm direito de fazer isso com a gente. Então, o sentimento é de injustiça, de dor, de pesar, de saudade. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente sabe que a gente não tem outra alternativa, que é continuar. É continuar até o fim. Eu vou continuar até o último dia da minha vida. O último dia da minha vida, eu ainda vou contar a história da minha irmã.
The pain that I went through, it was horrific because it was like a motion cinema picture watching my brother pass away. He was tortured to death. That was a modern day execution, and it was a lynching that shouldn't have never happened. I think about my brother every day. I wake up in the middle of the night, just wondering why? What did he do that was so terrible that he had to lose his life? It's never at ease. We're always trying to implement laws because we're thinking about the others who have passed away behind my brother. You would think that my brother would be the last person, but we haven't seen that. We've seen multiple people being killed. It's difficult knowing that your cousin or your brother has passed away and you have to sit there and go through this. Just like when we was in the courtroom, we had to watch him being killed over and over again. We live in this place where it's supposed to be the land of the free. But if people are dying because they looked at their cell phones and people thinking it's a gun, or you're dying because people just scared of you, it's a problem. It's not just African-American people who are dying. It's, you have Asian, you have Hispanic. People are just dying by the hands of the police. And it's sad, but you have good police officers and you have bad ones. You shouldn't have to sort them out. But our goal to me is to be able to live together, not against each other. It's difficult knowing that you can run from the police and they still will shoot you in the back with no weapon. You don't have any weapon. There's no reason that they should be met with police brutality. They should be met with support, dignity, and understanding, just like anybody else who they would want to pull over. First thing and foremost, you have to be strong. You have to be able to speak, because if you don't speak on it, they'll sweep it under the rug. And that's one of the biggest reasons that I'll get out and I'll try to speak with other families. Your skin color should never be a weapon.
Systemic racism, most fundamentally, is simply inequities among racial groups in society. Systemic racism impacts the enjoyment of rights across areas of society, such as employment, access to housing, access to quality education, and so forth. Just imagine the compounded effect that has on people's lives. And what makes this so brutal and brutalizing is its compounded impact on our lives, our human dignity and rights.
El mayor crimen de lesa humanidad cometido contra los pueblos afrodescendientes empezó con el secuestro y esclavización de nuestros ancestros y la explotación de África. Ese crimen no ha sido plenamente reconocido y reparado, y en pleno siglo XXI, los renacientes afrodescendientes continuamos viviendo las consecuencias de esos crímenes. ¿Qué variables pueden generar verdadera justicia racial en este contexto? Desarrollo no es nuestra esperanza. Nos afincamos en territorios soberanos, colectivos, de vida y alegría, donde se trabaja y cuida el presente y el mañana para nosotras y para todos, en nuestra lógica de vivir sabroso, con dignidad. Esa es una variable, la vida digna. Reconocimiento es otra variable. Para ello es necesario que se haya comprendido y por lo tanto reconocido que continuamos en un sistema de colonialidad y supremacismo que nos necesita en condición subhumana para sostener su régimen. Los mecanismos para sostener esa condición están en las deudas que nuestros países pagan al poder económico mundial, la explotación a la que están sujetos nuestros territorios amarrados a tratados comerciales corruptos, una cooperación diseñada para mantenernos en condiciones de dependencia, un sistema de estructuras corruptas donde la impunidad domina. Reconocer quiere decir tener en cuenta que se nos está ayudando, que no se nos está ayudando, sino pagando una deuda histórica por la explotación bajo la cual países ricos son ricos. Reconocer implica que se garantice que no se repite, que se corrige, y eso no está sucediendo. Por lo tanto, la otra variable es efectivamente la justicia. Tendremos justicia cuando se haya logrado vencer la impunidad y la corrupción que sostiene las estructuras de ese sistema de colonialidad de poderes capitalista, imperialista, supremacista, y países como Haití, primera nación en confrontar esa colonialidad de poderes y un ejemplo muy doloroso de racismo y de inequidad, dejen de ser intervenidos. Yo creo que podemos sentir que somos iguales cuando la oscuridad de nuestras pieles brille sin excusas en todos los espacios de la vida económica, política, cultural, social, no por los aceites aplicados para el show de esa democracia racial de celebraciones como la del día de hoy, sino porque finalmente estamos siendo vistos y tratados como seres humanos. Mi recomendación es simplemente honestidad y verdadero compromiso antirracista. El antirracismo implica esa voluntad política, de existir una honesta voluntad política para dejar de ser supremacías colonialistas e imperialistas, tendríamos países como Haití y pueblos como el mío viviendo al mismo nivel de bienestar y dignidad humana que todos ellos.
Systemic racism is a set of racialized norms that have been embedded in our law, our policy, our practices. And what it's done is really licensed atrocity. We start with the social construct of race as a historical reality that created change agents. We can find examples of systemic racism everywhere we look for them, in education, in health, in housing. Everywhere there's data disaggregated by race, we've been able to measure systemic racism. Doctors who are overwhelmed with too many patients default to anti-Black norms. Teachers assume less from their Black students. So we see that anti-Black racism and systemic racism operates with a common set of mindsets and norms despite national borders and cultural differences. We created a holistic intervention around race that not just allowed the exploitation of the labor of people of African descent, but also their intellectual property, their families, their children, and their futures. And in fact, in order to normalize this atrocity and to gain license to continue this exploitation, it was important for people of African descent to be defined as other. Even as we have declared things like enslavement illegal, we continue to struggle with the legacy mindsets, norms, and expectations of systemic racism globally. We have a culture of impunity where acts of racism and acts of systemic racism are often not subject to accountability or subject to even course correction. So part of the reversing of a culture of denial needs to start with acknowledgement. It needs to start with a commitment to accountability. It needs to start with an understanding of the right to reparations, which is an internationally recognized human right. When we're talking about transformative change, we're talking about disrupting a system that has defined our modern global economy, that has defined our modern transnational relationships. It's hard to understand how we could move things forward without serious, complex international commitments to really ensuring education reflects, rather than erases, the realities of people of African descent.
Amigos, colegas, agradezco mucho estas reflexiones, las personas que han compartido con nosotros el día de hoy y también las personas que han hecho testimonios a pesar del profundo dolor y las atrocidades que han pasado y que siguen levantando su voz por la justicia racial. Hoy también tenemos la suerte de tener presentes aquí con nosotros a dos expertas de Naciones Unidas, dos expertas que han trabajado muy cerca con la alta comisionada para este informe. Bienvenida Dominique Day, bienvenida Beren a este panel que estamos organizando hoy. Vamos a tener un pequeño diálogo con ellas, un intercambio. Dominique, en este momento, en estos meses, en estos 2 últimos años que estamos viviendo esta crisis sanitaria, crisis social, crisis ecológica, la estamos viendo en nuestras pantallas el día de ayer, el día de hoy. Para ti, ¿cuáles son las acciones primordiales que los estados y otros actores deben de realizar para efectivamente implementar esta agenda transformadora, esta agenda inspiracional que la alta comisionada ha puesto en manos de los estados? ¿Qué es lo que precisamente tienen que hacer? Dominique, por favor.
Thank you, Sandra. And let me just say at the beginning, in addition to my greetings to everyone in Costa Rica, and my thanks to UNFPA, OHCHR, and the government of Costa Rica for this important convening. I want to welcome the engagement of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights and of the Human Rights Council for its subsequent resolution, because these have been very clear leadership actions amid a lot of silence this year from spaces that did have the power and the ability to intervene. A year ago, I was having conversations with some folks even there about what leadership on anti-racism looks like. And this report has been a real beacon showing that kind of leadership we rarely see. So I'll send those greetings back to the Office of the High Commissioner. But I think, you know, it's actually really important. We're at a good moment, given that this is our celebration of the International Day of Recognition for People of African Descent. It's a good moment for us to sit and overlay some of the truths of this year, right? We understand that the ongoing and ubiquitous, ever-present presumption that we are disposable or that we are available for exploitation has shown up differently in different countries and different sectors. And I do have this question a year after this investigation began of whether we are acknowledging it or whitewashing it, specifically with respect to police reform. As we've seen in the video, as we saw in the report, this expectation of impunity has defined an entire field, and it's defined it internationally. And it's interesting, right? When we talk about it, a lot of people assume this has a lot more to do with the need for more training or the need for more policy or the idea that people committing atrocities against Black bodies, that people who are engaged in police brutality or engaged in the cover-up or justification of police brutality, that this comes from a lack of understanding, from a lack of ignorance. And yet that's not what we've actually seen to be true, right? We actually have decades of police reform activities, often under the oversight of a judge in several states. And the United States, which is one of the chief areas of focus for the High Commissioner's report and for police violence against Black bodies generally, also offers some of the most long-term negotiations of what police reform should look like, and also, very honestly, what those failures have been. So here's an example. We have the most common intervention to try to really renegotiate and mitigate, limit the use of force is a tactic we now call de-escalation. So instead of telling police officers they can only use force if they feel like their lives are at imminent risk, or they can only use force in certain circumstances, we've instead asked policing teams to embed de-escalation into their activities, right? So what does this mean? This means before you resort to force, you check in with a supervisor. Before you resort to force, you offer some non-force options. Before you resort to force in order to make an arrest, you figure out whether this arrest is really necessary or whether this is really a matter of control. And so we have quite a lot of de-escalation tactics. I can give you many of them. Some of them involve taking a step back, developing a tactical plan, and then coming forward. Some of them involve very specific check-ins. And yet, right, even in the climate of de-escalation, which has been a very common focus of police reform in the United States, even in the climate of de-escalation that pre-existed COVID, that pre-existed the murder of George Floyd, that pre-existed the over 100 murders of Black people we've seen by police in the last year, we still see a lack of de-escalation, right? Although the policy is de-escalation, although there are specific rules and structures around the use of force, we still see that during COVID enforcement, and there's videos of this all over the internet, we would see police walking up to Black and Latinx individuals in New York City and taking them down by the neck as they were walking on the street and calling this COVID enforcement. We have similar reports from Colombia. We have similar reports from other states. But it's a little interesting, right? Even in spaces where you've seen millions of dollars of investment in policing reform and changing the culture of policing, the tactics that occurred during COVID-19, the tactics that occurred during protests that started a few months later were actually quite the same, right? We're actually involved an immediate resort to violence, absolute expectations of impunity, and reforms that seem to have taken root in name only. And so I think there's a question for us when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about moving forward, about how much of this last year in our collective memory, in our cultural memory, in our international memory, has filtered out the racialization of what we have seen. How much of this last year has filtered out the racialization of COVID-19, where we have seen disparities along the lines of race in infection, severity, and mortality. How much of this last year has filtered out the racialization of law enforcement, although we have been talking about it? How much of this last year has filtered out the racialization of protest? Because unless we actually confront the expectation that violence, that impunity, and that unequal or preferential abuses of authority can occur to Black bodies, reform doesn't actually change much, right? Reform doesn't actually mean much. So we can look in a lot of spaces. We can look at our changes in policy, at our changes in training. And of course, these need to happen in many places. And yet we've seen that they don't have any impact, absent a real recognition and negotiation with the racialized conduct and the racialized expectations of policing and of other institutions that have historically been used to surveil and control Black bodies. And that space where we want an expectation of justice and equality, and we can't quite seem to get there, there's a reason for it, right? There's a reason for it. And part of the reason is it's been very uncomfortable for people to acknowledge the legacies of race. You know, there was a study that was done last May by some researchers here in the US that found that had reparations ensued after enslavement, had there been the political will and the understanding to offer reparations to people who'd been enslaved in Louisiana, in one state in the United States that is has very high cancer rates, very high death rates, and very high exploitation rates of people of African descent. There was a recent hurricane there. Had reparations ensued, it would have decreased the impact of COVID by 30 to 68%. That is massive. That is enormous, right? And we know, and I think maybe Vereen will touch on this, that where we saw reparations, we saw it going to white enslavers. So this question that we have of how can we reform, there's an answer that starts with, we can't actually just keep saying human rights are for everybody. Human rights should be applied equally. We don't need to think about race, because human rights are actually something that everybody needs to access. And so if we work towards human rights for everybody, ultimately race won't matter. But what we've seen historically, what we see currently, what we see everywhere we can measure it, are massive racial disparities. What we see in our everyday life and what we've seen in our historical reality globally and in our individual countries is that equality does not necessarily produce equity. And so our work to really make these reforms a reality, to really take the leadership of OHCHR and see if we can actually take this report and implement it and have real national dialogues that move things forward. Our work starts with refusing to filter out the racialized nature of law enforcement, the racialized nature of protest, of how we police protest, the racialized nature of COVID, and understanding that the minute we actually assume universality, we are already accepting the embedded systemic racism. This is true of vaccine equity. This is true of education, but we've had some real opportunities this year alone to really think about how this plays out in our own space. So we must ensure we don't whitewash. We need to erase the racialized lessons of 2020 and the events, the realities that have led up to them. We have 2020 as a really useful space to see how racial disparity plays out in a context where we refuse to talk about race or keep data about race, which many states did at the time. And we need to understand, right, the assumption of inevitability, the inevitability of a racial disparity is a powerful tool of systemic racism. The assumption of the necessity of force and violence to maintain order is a powerful tool of systemic racism. The assumption that complexity drives things like vaccine inequity or racial disparities in COVID or abuses of authority are powerful tools of systemic racism. So ending impunity, dismantling systemic racism, embedding expectations of racial equity and equality in our systems and in our communities. This is the real call to action for this International Day of Recognition of People of African Descent. And I think this is the real step forward we need to take as we start national dialogues, as we start international dialogues on what it looks like to really move from a space of whitewashing systemic racism to a space of confronting and dismantling it.
Muchísimas gracias, Dominique, por todo el trabajo que estás haciendo, por tu disponibilidad, por la gran reflexión que tienes y por recordarnos que desconstruir el racismo, que finalmente fue construido durante siglos, es un trabajo tan complejo y seguimos en sociedades y en situaciones de completa negación. Y es verdad que la agenda transformadora de la alta comisionada nos trae acciones concretas, siguiendo, recuerdo que Dominique Day es la actual presidente del grupo de expertos de las Naciones Unidas para los afrodescendientes. Están haciendo todo el grupo un trabajo fantástico. Nuevamente, gracias, Dominique, por estar trabajando con nosotros, por apoyarnos siempre. Y ahora daré la palabra a otra experta, Beren Schepper. Beren es actualmente la vicepresidenta del Comité de las Naciones Unidas por la Eliminación de la Discriminación Racial. Beren también fue presidenta del Grupo de Trabajo de Expertos para los Afrodescendientes. Beren es una académica, historiadora, y es verdad que es esencial tener una lectura histórica para justamente desconstruir todo el racismo. Entonces, Beren, en todo este trabajo que estamos haciendo actualmente, cómo podemos combatir el racismo sistémico y qué es lo que los estados, todos los actores de la sociedad debemos de hacer desde el área de educación. Es esencial que tomemos el área de educación. Tú, que eres una académica, profesora, que tienes tanta experiencia en el tema. Por favor, Beren.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sandra Aragon, our expert moderator. Your Excellency, Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, distinguished fellow panelists, and our online audience, a very good morning. Thank you for your question, Sandra. But first, let me say how very honored I feel to have been invited to participate in this forum. I am among the many around the world who have welcomed the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights historic report, which issued an urgent call for states to adopt a transformative agenda to uproot systemic racism. Its findings are important because they present an agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality. Its recommendations strike at the heart of what we need to do if we really want to eliminate racism, among them reversing cultures of denial, dismantling systemic racism, accelerating the pace of action, ensuring that the voices of people of African descent and those who stand up against racism are heard, and that their concerns are acted upon, and acknowledging and confronting legacies, including through accountability and redress by way of reparatory justice. This report casts a spotlight on the litany of violations of economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights suffered by people of African descent, including in the area of concern, education. For socioeconomic marginalization in the area of education is yet another manifestation of systemic racism that shapes the lives of people of African descent in many states and regions. The report highlights that people of African descent also face obstacles in gaining equal access to quality education. That's one of the first things we must fix: equity and equality in access to education. It also highlights that in several countries, reports highlight heavy and higher levels of illiteracy and of dropping out of school, as well as being subjected to racial discrimination in schools. So in the time allowed, the time I have left, I will focus on 3 areas of deficiencies in education and possible actions to address them. The first deficiency is inadequate attention to the content of history education in order to reverse centuries of Eurocentric content and empower people of African descent. We could also add the failure to make history education mandatory. It's no use talking about the content without talking about the right to history education, the right to ensure that people of African descent are anchored to a more empowering past. The UN High Commissioner's report correctly states, and I quote, "People of African descent continue to suffer from a lack of knowledge and recognition of their history, including the wrongs and racial injustices they suffer, culture, heritage, and contributions. Their history remains insufficiently or inaccurately addressed in educational curricula, particularly in relation to the history of enslavement, the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, and colonialism." The second deficiency I wish to point out is lack of education around reparatory justice. And the report identifies a long overdue need to confront the legacies of enslavement, the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, and colonialism, and to seek reparatory justice. The third is the failure of states to promote prominently memorial sites to people of African descent, in contrast to those of colonizers and enslavers. Monuments help to teach history in a visual way, and this needs to be addressed. So what can we do? First of all, teach history, make it mandatory at all levels of the education system. In a week in which we observe the inaugural International Day for People of African Descent, the date of which was influenced by Jamaican Marcus Mosiah Garvey, familiar to people in Costa Rica, especially those from Limon, I remind us all of his cautionary note that a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So it is important to raise awareness through information and education measures with a view to restoring the dignity of people of African descent, and consider making available the support for such activities to non-governmental organizations. We need to reform education institutions. We need to reform legislation, policies, and practices that may not be discriminatory in purpose, but that are discriminatory in outcome and effect. For example, differences in access to quality schools because of residential variations of location of children and schools. We need to ensure that children of African descent realize that, as Garvey said, the Black skin is not a badge of shame, but rather a glorious symbol of national greatness. Too many history texts and education systems bred in the past and still breed in the present a view of the hierarchy of skin shades grounded in white supremacist ideologies. I point to another imperative in the report. The High Commissioner stressed the importance of debunking false narratives that have permitted a succession of racially discriminatory policies and systems to persist and enable people and governments to deny both what is still happening now as well as what happened in the past. So we need to ensure that textbooks and other educational materials reflect historical facts accurately as they relate to past tragedies and atrocities, in particular slavery, the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, or the Maangamizi, so as to avoid stereotypes and the distortion or falsification of these historical facts, which may lead to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, including the role of respective countries. So states should pay attention to the content of history education in order to reverse centuries of Eurocentric content and empower people of African descent. Colonial history disempowers people of African descent. Culturally relevant history empowers. It gives pride. It reminds people of African descent about their greatness as a civilization that predated many European civilizations. It teaches them about their ancestors' contribution to the development of Europe. Children in European states should also learn African history so they too can understand what their ancestors did through conquest, colonization, trafficking in Africans, and chattel enslavement of Africans and indentureship of other groups, the looting of cultural resources and the underdevelopment of other countries, and the necessity of fighting together systemic racism. Reparation has become the greatest 21st century political movement to end structural discrimination and North-South inequities. So states should include intentional and dedicated reparation education in schools' curriculum. This will help them to understand its justification, the justification for reparation, the racialized precedents, for example, what happened in Haiti, the possibilities it presents for achieving peace and reconciliation among states. As the report points out as context, it is estimated that between 25 million and 30 million people were violently uprooted from Africa for enslavement. For decades, people of African descent in different countries have called for accountability and redress for harm suffered due to enslavement, the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, colonialism, and successive racially discriminatory policies and systems. In the DDPA, the link between the past, the present, and the future was established. And it was recognized that people of African descent continue to be victims of the consequences of slavery, the trade in Africans, and colonialism. Nonetheless, states have not yet adopted comprehensive measures of redress or reconciliation. There have been statements of regret and apologies and recognition by individuals and churches, financial and educational institutions. While the report highlights some promising local, national, and regional initiatives, it says no state has comprehensively accounted for the past or for the current impact of systemic racism. Instead, there remains a pervasive failure to acknowledge existence and impact of systemic racism and its linkages with enslavement and colonialism. So states must therefore apologize for their actions of the past, not just issue statements of regret, and they must engage in a reparatory justice conversation with affected parties in order to right the wrongs of the past. States should make themselves familiar with the CARICOM 10-point action plan for reparatory justice and other countries' blueprints. The Center for Reparation Research, which I direct, is about to publish a booklet on reparation for secondary schools. And this is a tangible way to combine education of the Maangamizi and the justification for reparatory justice. And so it will be available as widely as possible. And then the third issue is the visual landscape. We have to give recognition to the victims and their descendants through the establishment of memorial sites in countries that profited from and or were responsible for chattel slavery and other tragedies of the past. And we must mount these monuments at arrival and relocation points and by protecting cultural sites. And the High Commissioner report talks about that. So in conclusion, while there has been progress to combat systemic forms of racism globally, more is needed. The time is now for member states to review legislation, policies, and practices, and be honest about the possible role of state institutions in the perpetuation of systemic racism in education and through education. Culturally relevant education must include knowledge about the historic roots of structural discrimination and marginalization of people of African descent, because it is still the case that to be a person of African descent can be an unjust and unlawful reason for such a person to be subjected to inhuman and barbaric treatment and denial of equal access to sociocultural rights due to the color of his or her skin. The time for change is now. Indeed, the fourth in the 4-point agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality in the High Commissioner's report is redress, urging states to confront past legacies, take special measures, and deliver reparatory justice. The sooner we realize that we are all in this together, the sooner we will join with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Working Group of Experts in asking states to translate the report's agenda into action plans and concrete measures developed through national dialogues and with meaningful participation of people of African descent to address the specific histories, lived experiences, and current realities in each state. Thank you so much again for this opportunity.
Las gracias a ti, Beren, por recordarnos la importancia que tiene la historia, la verdadera historia, por la necesidad de revisar nuestros currículum, la necesidad de alzar monumentos a los héroes que construyeron nuestras patrias, la necesidad también apremiante porque los estados tomen acciones concretas por medio de planes de acción, por medio de diálogos, con la participación de los afrodescendientes. Es verdad que es un trabajo enorme, un trabajo que, como tú bien lo dices, no puede tardar, sino debemos de esperar ahora. Amigos, colegas, les agradezco muchísimo por su presencia, por su tiempo. Les agradezco mucho a las expertas por compartir con nosotros el resultado de todo su trabajo, de sus experiencias. Yo pienso que son necesarias estas discusiones que tenemos con la sociedad civil, compartir información, y nuevamente, como palabras finales, quisiera agradecer a todos ustedes por su presencia y también a los colegas que nos han ayudado a tener este espacio virtual, a todo el equipo de la vicepresidencia de Costa Rica y a mis colegas de UNFPA por el trabajo fantástico que han estado realizando todos estos 4 días. Así es que mañana termina la semana para los afrodescendientes, pero pienso que el trabajo es una tarea, el trabajo por la igualdad racial, una tarea que nos incumbe a todos y todas, todos los días de la vida. Muchas gracias y nos estamos viendo para una próxima actividad. Que estén bien. Adiós.